Day night. It is News Radio 600 KOGO. Darren and Jack, we're with you to the top of the hour here on this 12th day of October 2021. Supply chain. What does it mean? We hear a lot of conversation. There's a lot of casual conversations, Jack. We talked a little bit about it. A friend of yours taking pictures of empty toilet paper racks. I have a parent who's wondering what's going on for the holidays. My building manager said, "Oh, did you hear about all the cargo ships lined up off the coast of Long Beach? It's going to be a holiday season. Holiday shopping is going to be impacted." Thankfully, we have an expert. Professor Simon Kroom is with the University of San Diego, professor from their School of Business, an expert in supply chain management, and he joins us on News Radio 600 KOGO. Professor Darren Smith, Jack Cronin, thanks so much.
You're welcome. Good evening.
Well, we thank you for the time. Let me just start with a very basic question, because I think the term gets tossed out there a lot. I mean, what are we talking about when we're talking about supply chain? What does that mean exactly?
I say it's the story of everything. It's how we get the stuff that we eat, we wear, we use around the home, you name it, it's how we get that. And increasingly, it's the global, interconnected, complex networks of manufacturing, distribution, shipping, retailing, and so forth that actually enable us to get all this, all the products that we need to use.
And in your career of evaluating such things, have you ever seen anything like what we have experienced during the pandemic?
Well, I'm old enough to remember the 1970s, and the oil crisis had a big impact. We also saw the same, well, not exactly as complex as we've got now, but about 12 years ago, 13 years ago with the financial crisis, that had a big impact. But I think now we've got not so much a perfect storm, but we've got a confluence of a number of factors that are coming together, including COVID, to really exacerbate the supply chain problems.
See, Professor, that's interesting, because I think for a lot of people, they would presume that COVID was the reason why there seems to be issues with supply chain. What other factors are happening globally right now that seem to be impacting this?
Well, let's take the microchips issue, which is affecting so many different products. You know, the auto dealers' lots are almost empty because they cannot get supplies of vehicles. Toyota have got closure of 40% of their production lines around the world because increasingly we need intelligent chips in our cars. But we also have them in air conditioning units, washing machines, obviously computers. And with COVID, the demand for technology went through the roof. You know, as a university, we had to very quickly pivot to online teaching, which meant using Zoom and providing the equipment to do that for all of our faculty, administrators, and staff. At the same time, you have issues around the world of some of the trade deals. So we remember the 5G and Huawei controversy that's affected the US for sure, because we don't want any Huawei products in our 5G network. It's affecting Europe as well. So that was a reciprocal trade deal or trade conflict, which meant that Huawei did not buy products from the United States. They had to source elsewhere. So all of a sudden you've got a massive demand for chips that is now being satisfied outside of the US, Taiwan particularly, and Korea, and that sucks up all of that capacity. Then, if you're trying to grow capacity in a production facility where there is no surplus capacity, you've got to build another facility. That can be upwards of $1 billion to build such a facility, and can take 3 to 5 years to construct. And on it goes. You know, the old classic, you know, but for a nail, a kingdom was lost, if you know your Shakespeare. This is what we're seeing, several nails which are really disrupting this complex, interconnected system by which we get most of our products.
You know, heading into where we are, and you mentioned all of those factors, were we set up for failure heading into the pandemic? Were the margins just too slim to even have any sort of disruption, let alone a global catastrophe? Or what else kind of led us here?
I'd say yes, we were set up for failure. The problem, of course, is how do you predict the nature of a pandemic and the scale and scope of a pandemic. Most supply chains and most organizations try to focus on cost, which means they use something called lean supply chains. They don't want too much inventory in the system. They rely on regular, predictable deliveries. And you kind of hope that the demand is going to be relatively predictable. You know, toilet paper is the classic example of this. You know, the consumption rate is obviously very stable. The supply chains are obviously fairly stable, and they're fairly lean. When you get disruptions, and one of the disruptions was the massive sort of clamoring to buy up every toilet roll on the planet, and you get that across the globe. You also get issues that packaging, which uses pulp, so you're using similar raw materials for two very different product supply chains. You know, we all started buying online, which meant we needed a lot more packaging, and there is a big shortage of packaging at the moment, and that's clearly related to the problems we're having with paper products, toilet paper and paper towels, for example. So, yes, we were set up for failure because we relied on a very sophisticated, synchronized approach, which only works under certain criteria, which is relatively stable or predictable demand. When you disrupt that demand, it throws everything out of kilter.
Professor, you're already starting to see stories now. I would love your thoughts on this. You know, go ahead, start your holiday shopping now. Get to it a little bit earlier. I'm a pretty cynical fella. Sometimes I wonder if that's just a way to prime a pump, but obviously we're having a conversation tonight about supply chain for a very good reason. What would you say as we're into the middle of October? The holiday season starts for some with Halloween in a couple of weeks, and then into Thanksgiving, and then holiday shopping into December and into January. What would you say just about where we are with relation to the holiday season right upon us?
Well, you mentioned at the very top of the program, or the top of this session, that there are 140 plus container ships sitting off Long Beach. Those are clearly intended, many of them, for the holiday season, because if you're in retail, you order 6-7 months ahead of the Christmas season. You want delivery certainly now. So if it's not in transit and easily accessible, if we can't offload it at the ports, we're going to see real problems in getting supplies of a vast array of goods and products that we might want to use over the holiday season. Now, that can mean a number of implications. One, that there'll be significant shortages and prices will go through the roof. Two, that there'll just be scarcity and we'll have to tone down what we do at Christmas. And, you know, somebody with 5 grandchildren and I'm trying to plan for their gifts at the Christmas season, in some respects, I'm having to think about very different mix of products. And I think for many of my adult relatives, it's going to be either a gift card and you try and source your own supply, or here's some cash, you know. And that might be the way to do it.
Good.
To be honest, that might be the way to do it.
No doubt.
The food as well. It's going to affect our food supply chains. So that's a challenge for us.
So food and goods, is there, I mean, could you rattle off the top of your head? I know the list is probably too long for how much time we have left, but like, what sort of goods are we talking about here?
Well, I jokingly said to my students on Monday, make sure you finish your holiday shopping by the end of September. And they give me that sort of 1,000-yard stare and go, you do know it's October, Professor? I said, yes, I do know it's October. You're already too late, which is, you know, my thought particularly. You know, the supply chain for food is exacerbated by problems of labour. So we know the restaurants are struggling to get labour, even you know, high-end restaurants. It's not just the fast food guys. We know that agricultural supply chains are struggling to process vegetables, fruit, meat, and so forth. So it's definitely, you know, there's definitely what we call a pig in the python. You know, there's a big lump of problems slowly being digested by these supply chains. And I wouldn't to forecast because I don't want to be held hostage to such a thing. But I would not be surprised by significant shortages of most of the food products that we look forward to at the holiday season.
I was going to ask you, Professor, about the human impact too. Humans are part of the supply chain. It's not just, as you said, microchips and food products and all, but humans are part of this as well. What have you seen for the pandemic in that respect?
Do you mean in terms of labor?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, we know there are shortages of labor. There's also, I think, a realignment of how people want to work. Remote working, to a large degree, gave many individuals flexibility. But even more significantly, we had 12 to 18 months of that, and readjusting, and I speak personally here, readjusting to going back into a classroom, which I've been doing for 30 years before the pandemic, it's still quite a shock because I really had to rethink my social compass, really. I really had to think how I did my job. So in addition to labour shortages in terms of frontline employees, I think we're going to see significant shortages in the back office side of many organisations.
And Professor, last question for me would be, we're talking about the impact that this might have on individuals, on families. We live in a city in San Diego where I look around, I see a ton of construction projects. I see, many ideas for housing, et cetera. I wonder on a larger scale, too, what sort of impact this might have. If you haven't started construction, what might you have to wait for at this point?
Well, you're going to have to wait for structural steel and lumber, and the cost of those items has rocketed. We heard about lumber right at the very start of the pandemic, or a few months in, because everybody was at home doing construction or repair work or messing around trying to do such things. So that put a big pressure. At the same time as we weren't able to move products through supply chains. And I think it's fair to say that, the indications are that the cost of construction materials and the shortages, particularly of structural steel and lumber, are having a profound effect on the cost of construction. And I don't think this is a short-term disruption. I don't think it's a regional or national issue. I think it's a global issue that, glibly I could say it's going to get worse before it gets better, but I actually think we're going to have to see a significant realignment, and that's where the ingenuity of supply chain professionals comes in. Just give you one quick example. I was very impressed by how Bumblebee Foods, the local producer of tinned tuna fish and so forth, how they responded. They did what, as a professor, I would say was the classic, A+ response, which was, we've just got to trim the number of different products that we sell. Instead of selling 91 different types of tuna product, we're going to trim it down to 19. And, that is going to be one of the most fundamental shifts we'll see. Far less choice rather than lack of availability. So we might not be able to get turkeys that are 28 pounds plus in weight, or we might not be able to get organic free-range turkeys as easily, but we're still going to be able to get turkeys and turkey-based products.
Professor, fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for lending your expertise tonight. We really appreciated it.
You're most welcome.
Thank you. That is Professor Simon Kroom, USD Professor, School of Business, Supply Chain Management, his thing. Jack, we'll be back. Wrapping it up next on News Radio.